I'm so honored to introduce Joshua Lincoln, who's here after 25 years working on global governance frameworks across 4 continents, 13 years with the United Nations, half of that in Africa. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Law and Governance at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. We need to understand our global governance frameworks. How do these treaties work? Do they matter? Please join me in welcoming Joshua Lincoln.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Amy, and thank you to the Sun Valley and community for its warm welcome and hospitality to all of us. I ask you to forgive me if I stumble a little bit. I had a long travel day yesterday, and my body is 9 time zones away, so we'll do the best that we can. I was enthralled listening to Mark on the details of the energy transition, and I have questions for him, so I'm going to have to park those because I have no time. Like the rest of us collectively, we have no time. We have 90 months until the end of the critical decade, 2030, and we have 330 months until 2050, which is nominally the net zero year that we're all aiming for, and I have about 13 minutes to talk about it. So we're going to do our best. I wanted to, let's see, master this. Yes, we can skip that slide. I wanted to talk about cars. I know that might surprise some of you, but I wanted to talk about systems of global governance, institutional global governance. I want to suggest to you that they're like cars. This is a Cadillac produced in 1947. It's a Series 62, and it was considered a marvel at the time. A marvel of engineering. It's aesthetically beautiful. It went from 0 to 60 miles in 14 seconds, and it was a phenomenal engine that went 8 miles to the gallon. 2.5 tons of steel. Systems of governance are the same. We think of a need, we imagine it, we create it, we build it, then we use it a lot, and over time it gets slow. It gets tired, it gets stressed out, it doesn't respond perhaps to the needs that we have anymore. And as much as I love this car and I'd like to ride in it on a 4th of July parade, this is the car I would like to drive today, the Tesla 3. And the Tesla 3 goes 0 to 60 miles in 3 seconds. And it will go on average 300 miles without a gallon of gas. And our institutions are the same. If you think back to that first picture, that car was built within a year or two of the United Nations being created. And if you think about that car as the set of institutions that followed the Second World War, they were created, they reflected the beauty, the technology, the advancement, the understanding of systems of that time. And this is an example of how our institutions reflect the ways in which we think. Some of you may be familiar with the middle one. That's the 9 planetary boundaries, which is a new way to think about our world. And the one to the right is donut economics, which is again a new way to think about economics, prosperity, human health, and the environment. And the one up to the left is the organigram of the United Nations. I don't know if you see the difference between those, the difference from linear lines and boxes to cycles and circles and boundaries and limits and human well-being. But in a way, this is the struggle that we're collectively going through. I'll move on to the next. We live in a time of crises. It bears mention that 2 fundamental moments of institutional change in modern history followed 2 great world wars. And the question is, can we get fundamental change without necessarily going through a great world war? Because it turns out we need a lot of fundamental change. Thankfully, I'm using that word advisedly, we have a number of crises that may substitute for that and help us propel us along on that path of continuing to figure out what the institutional, organizational system of processes and systems that we require in the way in which we manage the planet. I'm not going to spend any time on this. I'm glad to discuss crises with any of you who want to over breakfast, lunch, or dinner. There are many of them to talk about, and there are very many different formulations of them. You'll notice up there that the UNFCCC and the head of UNEP talk about a triple planetary crisis, but their version of it is different from the Secretary General's down below, whose version of the triple crisis is food, energy, and finance. We could talk about what's happening in Ukraine. We could talk about how it makes all the rest of it complicated. This is an interesting list. This is a new concept called global catastrophic risks. By definition, that involves at least 10 million people and at least $1 trillion. And here's a non-exhaustive list put together by a foundation in Sweden called the Global Challenges Foundation about the kinds of problems that humanity faces today. You'll recognize some of them as, central, familiar to you already, and some of them, thankfully, we have never encountered and hopefully will never encounter. There's more work also being done. I'm sorry that the picture is fuzzy. This is a report by this Swedish Institute of Peace Research that is trying to understand the difference between simple risks and complex risks. Simple risk is you have risk A and it has consequence, and you have risk B and it has consequence, and you have risk C and it has consequence. And complex systems of risk, compound risk, cascading risks, emerging risks, systemic risks, and existential risks ask the question about how A, B, and C interact with each other, and how the consequences of each interact with the consequences of the others, and how one prevents managing the other. One way to move away from crises and to think about the world and the way it's changing is to think about the acceleration of 4 trends. The first is multipolarity. We live in the United States. The United States is still the acknowledged superpower of the world. And so we might be tempted to think from the comforts of the Pacific Northwest that it's a unipolar world. I think almost universally it is agreed that it is a multipolar world. We don't have to discuss geopolitics here in order to come to that conclusion, but that makes for far more complicated dynamics at the international level. Similarly, we have multiple levels of governance of all kinds. So we're not just talking about decisions being made by the United Nations Security Council's 5 permanent members. We're talking about the entire stretch from that level all the way down to the city board, educational board of Sun Valley and Haley. Multiple stakeholders exist in each of those levels, and we have seen a growth in those. So in climate negotiations, mayors play a part, youth play a part, indigenous communities play a part. In the Global Compact on Migration that was signed in 2018, mayors of large cities, including 17 large US cities, came to the table and demanded that their interests as mayors representing enormous constituents that were affected by migration should be heard at the actual negotiating table. And finally, the fourth issue is a multiplication of issues themselves and of their complexity. Very few governments today can afford the kind of apparatus you need in order to master what we call the carbon intensity of cement on the one hand, and the upgrading of medium-range nuclear weapons on the other. Never mind everything in between. And this increasing complexity of the world that we live in and of each of the issues that we have to be concerned of because of those global catastrophic risks is rapidly pushing many of us beyond the point of our capacities in those terms. Let's see if this will work. There we go. I wanted to talk briefly about the Paris Agreement, but I will not spend more than a minute on it, except to acknowledge that the Paris Agreement was based on a different concept from a lot of the previous treaties by which the global community ran itself. We don't have the time to go into it, but I would note that the conceptual model was different. And while it definitely led to a change, you have seen an absolute change in terms of the overall momentum among states, the fulfillment of responsibilities and the proof of that concept, in my mind, and I think for many others, is still very much in question. This is an example. 158 countries submitted revised national determined contributions, which was their pledges about what they were going to do on climate. Only 93 of those provided an additional level of ambition to what they had initially submitted 5 years previously. One could look at, this is an example, one of the ways you could look at how serious those commitments are is by looking at whether or not they included sectoral targets, which is targets by sectors of their economy. And you would see as you can see, a very differentiated picture. This is how many of the gases under the Kyoto protocols, their commitments included. Only the countries in yellow have included all 7 gases, for example. I would note 3 interesting developments to keep an eye on. The first is there are ongoing negotiations trying to get an agreement on the high seas across the finish line this year. This is obviously crucially important if you consider that half of the Earth's surface is concerned by this agreement. If you think about your own home, it's the equivalent that there have been no rules about behavior in half of your house so far. If you have kids, you know what that means. But it is an incredibly important step forward. Another one would be that there's work right now under the Biodiversity Convention going on to establish a framework for 2050 that would fundamentally change the way in which we approach biodiversity. And the last one I would mention is there's just been agreement a couple of months ago to start work on a global treaty on the handling of plastics, global plastics. Not just as a source of pollution, it would be a full life cycle treaty. So these are some of the interesting things that are happening in some of the corners of global governance. Mark spoke a lot about net zero and energy, and I'm going to leave that section aside if you don't mind and skip forward. I want to make one point about the net zero transition, which is it is going to define the middle of our century. It's an enormous step. The declaration of this, the set of targets, it's like taking a massive left turn. And a number of countries have signed up to them. Organizations, companies, cities have all signed up to these targets. But I think it's fair to say none of us understand the implications of these targets quite yet. They are bound to create a set of repercussions within states, social disruption. I work with a government, for example, who's thinking about the net zero transition, and they are very positively inclined to it, but they're not at all sure they can survive it because of the social changes that it requires in the spending patterns and the use patterns amongst their population. Interstate repercussions. We have seen the beginning of a new competition around rare earth materials, for example, all of those special minerals that you need in order to get to that next net zero economy. And the last is when you add the first and the second set, there are bound to be repercussions in the system as a whole. We don't yet know what those are. Anybody who tells you that they do, I'd like to talk to them. Send them my way, please. I think we're going to learn a lot in this process. This, for example, is just a map of rare earth minerals in the world. It's going to reshape the map of the world in very real terms. I'd like to finish with a story from Sir Christopher Wren, who was, as you no doubt know, an architect in the 1660s in England. And he worked over building a series of, I think it's 40 or 50 churches in London, including rebuilding the great cathedral. And there's a story that goes around about Sir Christopher Wren that he walked around the cathedral when it was being built, and he asked the question, "What are you doing?" to 3 different workers. And since there wasn't Facebook at the time, nobody knew what Sir Christopher Wren looked like. So he approached a stonemason, and the stonemason said, "I'm cutting stone." And he approached the second person, it was a man who was digging ditches, and he said, "I'm making 3 shillings and 6 pence a day." And he approached the third person, who was a woman who was watering horses. She says, "I'm helping Sir Christopher Wren build a great cathedral." And this story is usually told in the context of saying you should answer the third answer, which is understand your great purpose. I would submit to you, to everyone who has a great idea, to everyone who has a project, a new company, a new technology, what are you doing? Are you building a new battery? Are you making 3 shillings and 6 pence a day? I hope you're making more. Or are you helping create the new climate future? There's no correct answer to this. I would suggest to you that everybody needs to ask all 3 questions. You need to be able to answer all 3 questions. And in that process, to think through the capacities you need for that next stage. Those capacities, This is an example of carbon tunnel vision. I like this diagram very much, that you should get so focused on carbon that you forget about all the other problems and issues that you have to address in the process of dealing with the carbon question. That much is absolutely clear. If you move forward, in some of my research work, we've identified 3 capacities for success. I'll finish on those. These would apply in the context of my research to states and to governments. I would suggest to you that they would apply to any actor, including individuals, who are trying to figure out how they answer Sir Christopher Wren's question. 3 capacities: to find partners and fora for success, and to do so early, quickly, decisively, repeatedly. The second is to embrace agility, both internally and externally. And the third is to rebalance effectiveness and trust. And that's maybe the hardest conceptual one, but perhaps also the most important one of the lot. This is a balance of inclusion. We had an important statement earlier about indigenous peoples. I would include the involvement of women and questions of gender in particular in every aspect of these questions. But I would also include technocratic expertise and scientific cooperation, although that last one is primarily for states at that level. There are increasingly specific questions you can ask flowing from each of these. And no matter what your project is, your idea, your company going forward, including, for example, on the inclusion one, are you relying on what's called sex disaggregated data? If you're not, you are not taking an approach that will be beneficial more broadly, and that is in many, many cases the test of how we move from good intentions are not good enough, good ideas are not good enough, good innovation by itself is not good enough if it doesn't begin to take into account that wider perspective, that wider awareness of social needs and desires and pathways. I'll close with that thought. We don't know where we're going next. We don't know what the Tesla of the global governance world is yet. And it's a little bit when you go on a hike. If you don't exactly know the path, if you don't exactly know the destination, you pay a lot more attention to the quality of your hiking in the present. And I think that would be the one takeaway I would suggest, the one question that we can have more conversation on. Thank you very much.